What man shall bind a noble beast and call the wolves his due? Here, then, beneath a moon like a coin cast down the throat of heaven, a millionaire fastens a thoroughbred to an old oak and offers its chest to midnight. See the silk and iron of his fortune. Smell the smoke of hearths put out by pride. The horse stands, nostrils working like small bellows, eyes black as truth. Around them the fen breathes low and long. The wolves answer with jeweled howls, a chorus to a verdict. Who is he, this great lord of ledgers, who will barter life beneath stars for some hunger in his soul? What debt is paid by iron and rope and the cold appetite of the pack? The estate calls him generous. His ledger calls him sovereign. Alone he calls himself by an older, surer name, one no coin can buy. Yet tonight, under that coin moon, a whisper of a locket and a clean handprint of old grief will make him stand where choices split like lightning. Will the horse, bound and breath-swept, be led to slaughter by the teeth of winter? Or shall some stranger mercy break the law of wolves and wealth alike? A question hangs, hungrier than the pack. What happened next? Rowan Hargrove kept houses the way kings once kept wars, quietly with trophies on the wall and debts tallied in silence. His manor squatted like a satisfied beast upon a ridge. Its chimneys sent up the thin, white arrogance of smoke. Men called him generous when their furlongs were paid. They called him merciless when their pleas fell on the marble of his palms. He measured the world in columns, acres, alliances, and accounts. He measured himself in absence. Autumn had a way of flattering his lawns, then turning them to brittle confession. The trees outside his stable shed leaves like discarded promises. In the stable, Tempest, gray-mottled, ribbed with speed, stood in the shadow where straw lay like gold spilled and forgotten. Tempest was bred for the track, for the shallow thunder of crowds and the clean arithmetic of speed. Yet on his flank was a pale seam of a scar, a white scar that curved like a question. No ledger could explain that curve. Rowan walked there at dusk, his boots swallowing the sodden hush, a silver watch in his fist that ticked neglectfully of the hours he had refused to forgive. He touched the horse as a man touches a ledger, expecting obedience. In years past, before the cold calcified something in his chest, he had loved horses with a love blunt and raw. His wife Eleanor had loved one in particular, a mare named Lyra whose coat had gleamed like a promise. The memory of her laugh still lodged in his throat when he tried to speak at night. He kept one small thing of Eleanor's habit, a black glove folded in a drawer, the leather worn at the thumb, a token he had never returned to the world. That glove, that laugh, they were the true debts in his life. He paid other debts easily, taxes, fines, favors. There was a debt he did not know how to tally, the absence of a child he never saw, the hush at his table where voices should have been. Grief had taught him a cruelty like frost. It preserved what remained by driving away whatever might warm it. On a bad day, if a man may be reduced to his worst day, Rowan made a wager with his own heart. He believed cruelty might prove something. He believed that if he could show the world that the strong could choose indifference, indifference would turn into power. This belief sat in him like a coal, and at times he tossed it at others to see them burn. That night, Tempest was tied to an old oak by a chain not meant for a creature of the track. The chain bit into bark and leather. A bridle hung at the horse's head, but the bit had been removed and a locket dangled from the cheekpiece. A tiny circle of tarnished silver marked with an initial, E. The locket winked under the moon like a small sin. The stable boy who had left it there had left with more haste than apology. His footprints fled like questions. There was no call to Rowan from the house. His servants said nothing that could pierce the hush. Around the outer moor the wolves had been seen all week, gaunt as rumor, patient as respect. They came down in packs where hunger made them honest. Villagers who lived near the hedge trees cursed the winter and Rowan both, for wolves respected neither favor nor fortune. To bind a race-bred horse for them to find was to promise spectacle to the dark. Rowan stood and watched Tempest draw breath, saw the white seam on the animal's flank pulse like a pale tide, and the scar told a story he could not read and yet somehow recognized. He felt like a man who has mislaid a key and finds instead the hole it fits. That this horse had the shape of something he had once known, but would not allow himself to call by name. He touched the silver locket with one finger and felt the cold of it, the small weight of memory. Something small and stubborn opened inside him, not pity, not yet, but a recognition that required explanation. He had set the bargain, a horse, a knot, wolves, He had not bargained on memory. A gull of wind carried a distant howl. The manor's windows were lightless. Rowan turned back to his ledger of reasons and found, written in ink he could not decipher, a single line he had tried to forget. Men can be saved by shame as easily as damned by it. He left the stable and the world narrowed to the crunch of his own shoes on the lane. He would return at dawn, or he would not. Neither sentence was yet chosen. The first howl ripped the distance like a seam. It was not the single long note of the moor, but an answering chorus, thin, hungry, threaded with the teeth of numbers. Rowan felt it as a challenge. He told himself that morning would hold all answers, a knife to the chain, a torch, a word of law. Yet as the moon thinned and clouded, the night seemed a bowl of dark water and the wolves its skiffs. He heard the scrape of iron on bark. The horse shifted, a slow articulation of muscles that remembered speed and feared rust. Tempest's ears pricked, small triangles of intent, and his breath drew frost. Rowan crouched close to see the brand beneath the scar. It was not the racing house's mark. It was older, a faint cross within a circle like a token of a farm that had fallen into song in the valley. He had never seen that mark on one of his horses. A memory cracked. Eleanor once mentioned a mare stolen in a storm the year they married, a mare with a white flank. Rowan had laughed it away then, a joke that grew teeth. He had been careless with remembrance, pruning it into neatness. Now the neatness returned to its wild state. He reached for the locket and opened it with the fumbling of a man unused to small mercies. Inside was a portrait, Eleanor's profile, painted on a scrap of paper so tiny that his thumb hid the sorrow within. A curl of hair had been pinned behind her ear in a style she favored in winter. Rowan's breath stopped. A clock in his chest miscounted its beats. The sight rewired him. Memory flowed back not as narrative but as ache. Laughter at a kitchen window, a sudden rain in which they had run without cloaks, a child's first cry that never came to be. The locket was not his to keep. It was a rope, pulling him in some other direction than the one he had chosen. He sat on a fallen root and watched the horse. Tempest did not lower his head to the grass. He rested it against the trunk and shivered. A low, involuntary whinny escaped him, half plea, half promise. Wolves drew nearer. Now the laughter of the pack rippled through the trees, and a silver eye flashed between two trunks. A single animal padded into the open, large and lean, its pelt shot through with moonlight. Then another. Then a procession of bright, wet eyes. Rowan felt the old algebra of his life collapse. Credit, debit, profit, against something rawer, the tremor of a hand wanting to mend what his ledger had mangled. He understood that to move was to confess. If he cut the chain and took Tempest in, the house would swell with rumor and perhaps pity. If he left the animal, rumor would be quiet and his conscience perhaps a different beast. He produced a knife, small and fine, an instrument of many bindings. His fingers found the leather of the chain link as if they remembered belonging. He took hold and began to saw. The first squeal of metal on metal was a small human noise of hope. He worked with an awkwardness that angered him. The chain was old and stubborn, and his hands were not those of a man who labored. Tempest watched as if he understood that a scene of rescue often contained a punishment for the rescuer. A cry from the hedgerow, an animal voice not quite human, caused Rowan to spin. A figure moved through the trees. A boy or a small man wrapped in a rough coat, his face smudged with smoke. He was not one of the manor servants. He moved with the furtiveness of those who have slept by hedges and eaten what was not theirs. In his hand he carried a lantern that swung as if guiding fate. "Who are you?" Rowan demanded. The man's words were flat. His eyes were bright with fear and something like accusation. "You bind what is not yours to bind." Rowan's first impulse was to order him away. Pride had always taught him to correct the world with sharp commands. Yet the man's mouth formed another name, thin as thread. Tempest. Tempest, Rowan repeated, incredulous. "This—" He gestured to the horse and the locket, and the stranger's face shifted as if a door had been opened in the dark, and a new house smelled of fresh bread. "I know him," the stranger said. "We raise this line in the valley, sir. That brand—" He pointed at the faint cross and then glanced away. He swallowed. "He carries more than speed." The lantern bobbed. In its light, the stranger's hand brushed the bridle and then drew back as if burned. "My name is Micah," he said. "I came to beg, not to scold." "The wolves—" His voice broke. They'll tear him if you do not cut him loose and take him in. Rowan had a ledger for pleas. He opened it now and nothing fit. The house law, the village law, the law of men. None spoke to the small interior law that a man felt when a portrait of the dead looked from a pocket and accused him of every omission. He freed the chain at last with one desperate pull. Metal snapped like a small truth and Tempest jerked forward, testing the new air. He did not bolt. Instead, he reached out his muzzle and lightly touched Rowan's wrist, the gesture like a question of whether the man had returned from exile. The contact was electric, simple, physical, and before his pride could gather itself to scoff, Rowan understood something he had not allowed himself to suppose, that animals keep ledger lines of a different kind, that they remember faces, scents, and small mercies. But the wolves did not wait for human understanding. The pack circled, their noses tracing the air like compasses, their feet barely making sound on the leaf litter. One slid forward with an insolent air, shaking its neck. Another stayed in the shadow, a silhouette with eyes like two coins. A low growl threaded the night, the kind that announces not hunger alone but challenge. Rowan looked at Micah, who had drawn back as if the very sight of the pack was a reprimand both to master and to man. Between the trees, someone else shouted, a voice from the hedge where the village met the Hargrove lands. It was the gamekeeper, a heavy-bellied man who ran loyalties as one might run a plow. "You cannot hold him here, Rowan," the man called. "The law," he coughed the word into the fog. "The law will take this and make you answer for cruelty." Rowan's chest tightened. Answers were foreign things. He had not prepared them. In the span of a breath, his life split on a hinge. To cut the chain and carry the horse home was to invite scandal. Accusations of theft, of meddling in other farms, of harboring a creature that might be claimed. To leave Tempest to the wolves was to hold to the bargain he had thought himself righteous to make. The horse stamped. Tempest's muscles rolled like coiled rope. His tail twitched with the impatience of one built for straight lines of speed. He turned his head, and in the movement something happened, not of plot but of sentiment. He lifted his nose to Rowan and blew a small, dusty breath that smelled of hay, of race day dust, of the mouth of Eleanor. The locket swung and the portrait inside flashed pale and accusing. "Cut him loose," Micah said, suddenly urgent, "or I'll cut him free myself." "Do you want to be charged with theft?" Rowan's voice was sharper than he meant. Fear had sharpened it. He looked at the wolves. They were an honest audience. He looked at Tempest. The animal's breath fogged small moons into the air. Something small in Rowan. Some unbought tenderness stirred. The chain lay like a sentence between them. He moved his knife hand to the lock and then hesitated. Memories pressed at him. The laugh of Eleanor, the sound of a child's shoe on a hall he had emptied, the shape of a promise he had not kept. He thought of the glove in the drawer and how many times he had told himself that love could be measured by what one keeps. He cut the lock. Metal fell with a tiny, decisive sound. Tempest pulled at his bit and then stood still, a soldier returned to duty. Rowan held him close and felt the horse's ribs rise against his palm. It was an intimacy he had not expected to keep, and it made his throat ache as if a tide had come in too quickly. But the world had not changed for one coin of mercy. From the edge of the moor a different sound rose, thunder far off or perhaps the rapid hoofbeat of something coming. A shadow loomed, darker than the trees. The wolves circled tighter, their shadows like ink spilled over the land. And then from that shadow a shape detached itself that was not wolf, not man, but a figure on a horse of black so deep it drank the lantern light. Rowan looked up. The rider's face was hidden in a hood. Their approach was too sure for a peasant, too calm for a night thief. The horse beneath them snorted once and stamped, as if to say that whatever game had begun in this grove was not over. "Who comes?" Rowan croaked, though he already feared the name. The rider pulled down their hood in a motion like dropping a veil. The face that emerged was not one Rowan had expected. It was pale and set, eyes like old coins, and in the white cut of their cheek a scar like the one on Tempest's flank, identical as if done by the same hand. Recognition, swift and horrible, fell between them. "You," Rowan said, and the single syllable held a history. The rider smiled, a blade without mercy. "You have brought him here." A stench of iron and fate entered the night. The wolves braced. Tempest stamped uneasy. The moon slid behind cloud. Rowan's hand sank into a small pocket. He found his house key and wrapped in it something crumbled and dear, the other half of Eleanor's glove. He had come to bind the beast. He had not thought that binding would bind him in return. As the rider reined in, the horse beneath them dipped its head and whinnied once, an answer that was not of wolves but of recognition. The stranger's voice was low and clear. If you will not save him, someone else will see he is made to answer. Rowan did not know whether the words were promise or threat. He only knew that the night had become a ledger of impossible sums. The pack's hunger, his wife's portrait, the stranger's scar, the sound of a child's step on a stair that had never echoed. Then, before a human breath could decide the thing, Tempest did what no one had counted upon. He reared with a force that shook the branches, eyes bright and white as bellows. With a single heave, the chain snapped at the tree, the iron failing where it had been fastened so long. Tempest leapt free, not away from the wolves, but toward them, hooves pounding a drumbeat across the leaf mat, nostrils wide, mane like a flag thrown to the wind. Rowan staggered, the world cleaving into the sound of hoof and the howl of wolves. Micah cried out and lunged forward. The stranger reached for reins that were not meant to be caught. The pack barreled in a crescent. And in that thunder of motion, something small and awful fell from Tempest's bridle. A folded scrap of paper that fluttered like a pale bird and landed at Rowan's boot. He stooped, tore it open with fingers that trembled, and read in a hand he thought he had buried with the years. Forgive him not for his deeds, but for the debt you owe me. The wolves closed. The night broke like a shell. Wolves closed in, their bodies a living shadow over leaf and root. Their eyes were the small cold coins of hunger. Rowan's breath burned a pale confession into the air. Micah's lantern trembled. His hands were wet with fear. The rider, Elias, for that was the name that fell out of his mouth like a verdict, sat bloodless in his saddle, the scar on his cheek a white question that matched Tempest's white seam. He had insisted, with a steady voice and a hand that did not shake, that the horse be taken away. He insisted now with words that edged in iron. You have kept what should not have been kept, Elias said, and his tone was not accusation only but also a kind of ache that had been long wearing thin. You were given the choice and you named yourself judge. Rowan's palms were small and pale. He tried to shape a defense, accounting law precedent, but the night swallowed each figure like rain. Tempest stood between them, nostrils flaring, ears twitching like twin cypress leaves. The horse's eye was a deep, honest thing. It held the past and the possibility of mercy, without weighing them in coin. The locket at Rowan's breast ticked against his chest, a little heart of remembered warmth. Rowan felt it there as if the dead were present in 3 dimensions and all 3 wanted reckoning. Elias slid from his saddle with the slow grace of a man who has been taught to move well by danger. The horse beneath him stamped and flared, its breath smoke. Elias's boot found moss and his fingers curled on a riding crop like a question mark. He lifted the crop and tapped Tempest's flank, not cruelly, rather as a man might prod an old friend to wake. The horse turned. In that pivot lay the pivot of fate. Take him, Elias whispered to Micah, lead him to the valley. Keep him from pride and ledger, and the wolves that appetite makes. He belongs with us. Tempest's nostrils quivered. He smelled 2 homes in the air. The valley, green and low, and Rowan's ridge, cold and marble. Animals keep ledger lines differently. Scent, voice, the pressure of a hand. Tempest shifted his weight and his hoof made a small punctuation upon the ground. He did not move toward the valley. He did not move toward Elias. Instead, he came again to Rowan and rubbed his nose against the man's palm, so softly that it was as if the horse itself were giving absolution and asking permission at once. Elias's jaw tightened. The scar at his cheek seemed to twitch with memory. You would bind him for spectacle, he said. You would make your cruelty into theater. The wolves will do what men have done, devour what refuses to serve them. Is that what you would have of yourself? Rowan swallowed a dry ocean. His voice stumbled. Shame folded him. He had thought himself clever to proclaim indifference, and in that thought he had been selfish of the most intimate kind. He saw now the ledger line he had never written down, the cost of his coldness to those he loved. The wolves edged closer, their forms an undulating punctuation of teeth. One slipped out from the pack, its fur climbed with the sheen of moonlight. It lowered its head as if measuring the prize. It had the patient hunger of a thing that tests the world by small prods. Its eyes locked on Tempest's flank. that white seam that marked a story none of them yet told aloud. Elias made a step forward.
"Stand aside, Hargrove," he said.
"Let the rightful hands move what you would not keep." Rowan's hand closed around the locket. He remembered Eleanor's laugh in the rain, the warm geometry of her palm. The locket weight was a summons. He looked at Tempest, his breath rose and fell like a prayer, and then at Elias, whose face had the map of a year of want. For a moment, the past and the present braided together so tightly, Rowan felt his own ribs might split. He had been a man who thought himself absolved by the purchase of things. Here was a ledger that called for a different currency. Something tightened in Tempest. He flared, nostrils like bellows, and with a motion that was exactly horse and yet almost human in its intent. He planted his forelegs and reared. The motion threw him higher than the saddle of memory, mane a banner. For an instant the night was full of the thunderous arc of horse. The wolves blended into the dark and everything. Man, beast, hunger hung by a thread. Then Tempest descended not toward the wolves but toward the rider's horse. He struck with a hind leg, a movement honed by necessity and born of fear. It was a clean animal logic. Strike where the leverage is, where balance breaks. The rider's horse reared, the pair of equines entangled like storm and rope. Elias's mount lost footing on slick moss, and the rider came down in a scramble of leather and curse, his hood falling back and revealing the full geography of his face. He slammed into the earth with the small, terrible sound that announces a man's vulnerability. The wolves, surprised by the sudden violence between two other beasts, made for the confusion. Micah lunged with a pole. Rowan shouted with a voice that remembered thunder. For a terrible beat, fear was not a calculated thing but a living current. A wolf leapt, jaws wide, toward Tempest's flank. But Tempest pivoted and struck out. The wide arc of his hooves a dangerous geometry. A wolf snapped at the horse's rump and found only air in the hard press of flank. Another found itself buffeted by a hoof and tumbled into the leaf mat. In the pressure of that instant, Tempest did something no ledger had predicted. Instead of fleeing when chaos rose, he turned and pressed his forehead to Elias's chest as the man lay half-stunned on the wet earth. The gesture was not a gambit of training nor a calculation. It was a recognition played out in the small formalities of scent and years. The horse's breath warmed Elias's coat. His ears lay as if in forgiveness. He shook as if with the shiver that follows the storm's passing, and when he looked up, his face was not the mask of hunter but of one who has found the place he most feared to see. Micah said, voice small as a child's first wonder. He had known the valley tale. He had not known the man who would come to test the millionaire. Elias breathed in the horse's scent, and his scar glowed like a fresh bloom. "Eleanor sent me," he said. Each syllable a pebble rolled into a deep pool. "She feared you, Hargrove. She feared you would measure mercy as you measured coin. She wrote," he spat the word as if tasting ash. "She wrote me a scrap before she left us. She told me to set a test, bind the horse, and see if you choose well. If you kept him tied for the wolves, then you were lesser than the name you bore. If you were moved, then perhaps there was something left of the man I would have called brother." The scrap that had fallen at Rowan's feet proved the key. Rowan still held it, edges damp with night. The handwriting, Eleanor's, was as he remembered, a small, stubborn script. The sentence that had clenched him in part one now breathed an explanation. She had written not to excuse, but to force a choice. "Forgive him not for his deeds," the line had said, "but for the debt you owe me." Carcon she had meant it as Gale and Test both. She wanted repayment of a heart, not punishment. Elias's voice broke. The wolves, seeing the rider on the grass and the other man standing with the horse between them, hesitated, their hunger checked by the strange social rules that govern packs and people. Animals know when the argument between men is over being mere hunt. They sense apology or its lack. They listen for the cadence of peace. Rowan sank to his knees then, the motion so sudden that the night held its breath. He had no ledger for what to say. There were no numbers to align. He laid the locket, warm with the shape of a woman, upon Elias's chest. "Forgive me," he said, almost ridiculous in his simplicity. "Forgive me for everything I have counted and never valued. Forgive me for choosing coldness." Elias took the locket as if it were a weapon, turned it with shaking fingers until the portrait of Eleanor was upon them like a small, accusing sun. Tears, raw and honest, welled in his eyes. He did not give back the pity that could have made Rowan lesser again. Instead, he gave voice to a different verdict. She did not want procession of cruelty, Elias said to the moon. She wanted to know if love was left in the house where she had placed her heart. If you would learn to be less, then take him home. If you would not, then give him to us and keep your ledgers. Rowan looked at Tempest. The horse, his chest rising and falling like bellows, stamped the earth with impatience for an answer that was human. The decision opened like a door in a house that had been sealed too long. Rowan placed his palm upon the horse's neck, rough and small, and he felt there the great and steady truth that animals give freely. A reliance not on contract but on trust. Then take him, Rowan said, and his voice was a river breaking its ice. Take Tempest. Keep him from wolves and from men who would make spectacle of his fate. But know this. If you take him, you take also what I was, and you will watch whether I learn. Elias's face moved through a calculation. He looked to Micah, to the lantern, to the scattered wolf prints that whitewashed the earth with direction. He looked last at the locket. There in that small oval, Eleanor's painted profile watched them like a judge softened by pity. Bring him to the valley, Elias said. We will see what you will be. Rowan bowed his head as if the simple movement could wash a ledger clean. He had been measured by many. Tonight by the horse's breath and a dead woman's handwriting, he was measured anew. A wolf, a young one smaller and more curious than the rest, stepped toward the party and sniffed at the air. It found no greed in the motions of the men. Its sniff turned to a yawn, and it melted back into the dark like a tide. The pack, misunderstanding their feast, loped away like a tide withdrawn. The threat dissolved not by steel but by a small string of honest acts. Tempest's interposition, Rowan's surrender, Elias's mercy. The night breathed out, but mercy does not arrive without cost. As Tempest settled, lowered to his head as if bowing, an equine benediction, Rowan felt a pain flare at his calf where a wolf's tooth had grazed in the confusion. He staggered and Micah caught him. The wound was not mortal, but it bled truth, a mark upon a man who had been marked by his own deeds. He had been stung by consequence, and that sting would teach. Dawn came as a pale, tentative thing, and with it the motion of decisions made under star and shock. The valley's slow people bundled their concern into a cart, and Elias, having accepted the man in a way that matched the way his sister had set commands from beyond, offered terms that were more like work than ransom. Tempest would not be taken abruptly. Instead, he would be walked to the valley with a small company to escort him. Micah with lantern, Elias with the cart, and Rowan, who walked with a crutch of conscience and a wound that would remind him of the night. As they went, the land disclosed itself in new ways. Hedgerows that had seemed only boundaries now read as lifelines. The moon's remains shimmered on puddles like thin silver coins. Villagers peered from thatch and shutter, mouths uncertain, eyes making maps of who had sinned and who had been redeemed. Word traveled like a cautious bird. The millionaire had been humbled, the horse had been saved, and a dead woman's handwriting had judged her living. Rowan walked slowly. Each step taught him the simplicity of mortal things, how the weight of a body, the slope of a road, the smallness of a wound, could alter the course of a day. Elias walked beside him, not with triumph, but with the sober air of one who has kept a promise. She wanted better for both of you, Elias said once simply. She wanted you to be broken enough to be made whole. Micah pushed the cart. His hands were steady now, his face cool with the kind of pride only survivors know. They spoke in small sentences that filled the way with the grammar of mending. They reached the valley where Tempest's old field waited like a harp. There were others there, men and women who once bred and tended, faces lined by weather and the patience of living. They regarded Rowan with an appraisal that is not law but history. Tempest, led at the bridle by Micah, moved as one who carries two hearths in the ribs, one of past speed and one of new refuge. He would not forget his scar. He would not unlearn where he had run. But horses hold recall like a slow river. Memory does not tie them to bitterness unless men teach them so. He lifted his head and whinnied once, a small sound that made the valley listen. Elias and Rowan spoke at the edge of the field, where talk could be private in a place where everything living seemed to know its place. You must learn to choose, Elias said with an earnestness that had been forged in grief. She asked me to test you, not to shame you, but to give you a mirror. He tapped the locket perched now at his breast. The painted Eleanor watched them all as if from the other side of a window. Rowan tried to answer. He found only a ragged gratitude. "I will learn," he said, and the first syllable was not a bargain but a vow. He put his hand in the soil, pressed it like a man who would plant himself anew. Micah, who had been the nearest to the small human tragedies all night, looked to Rowan and then to Elias. "Would you have him stay?" he asked at last. "With you? Or with the house?" Elias's gaze slipped to Tempest and then back. "He should have a home where his speed is honored but not exploited," he said. "We will keep him. But Hargrove," he added, eyes sharp as an auger, "if you would be part of him, come often, and come not with ledger but with hand." Rowan set his jaw like a man resolving to repair what is broken. He understood now that the currency Eleanor had asked for was not the wash of gold, but the small companionable acts: a warm stall, clean water, a hand that feeds. He had not been asked to atone by coin but by habit. He bowed his head to Elias and extended what little he offered: regular work at the valley, the funding of fences, and his presence. Elias accepted these not as payment but as the beginning of trust. The wolf problem was quelled by talk as much as by action. Men from the valley set snares where the land thinned. They hung jars of oil and filled them with scents to deter the pack's hunger. They lit fires at night and kept watch. The wolves did not return to the ridge again that season. Nature, like men, accepts a recalibration. In the days that followed, the estate's rumor mill turned toward other intrigues. But those who had watched the ridge knew a different truth: that a man of means had been measured and found mutable. Rowan set out to change his household not by proclamation, but by practice. He gave the glove in his drawer, not back to any living hand, but to Eleanor's grave placed upon the stone like a quiet promise. He became a presence at the valley stables, his hands learning work that his ledgers could not teach. In time, small voices returned to his house, not the chitter of coin but the laughter of children who ran races near the stables, and who were sometimes allowed to brush Tempest's flank with hands both rough and gentle. Tempest, safe in the valley, answered more than one human sorrow without knowing he did. He ran in a field where children watched him and men tended him. He bore riders who were kind and steady and learned that a scar can be a story offered, not a wound to be reopened. He came sometimes to the edge of the valley where Rowan stood and lowered his head for a greeting. Rowan in time lost the immediate sharpness that had hardened him. It was replaced by a patience that animals teach, a slow accumulating warmth. Months passed like pages turned. The house on the ridge kept its bricks and its debts, but within its walls there came a change like the slow green growth of moss reclaiming stone. Rowan learned to count other things: time given, hands extended, the sound of a horse's breath in the night. He became, in small measures, less a sovereign and more a neighbor. Elias and Rowan did not become blood brothers that quick. Reconciliation is not the work of a single evening, but they mended into something practical: kind regard, shared labor, a trust that admitted ruin and nevertheless chose repair. One evening, with the valley's fires a soft constellation behind them, Elias brought Tempest to the ridge. He rode him not as a conqueror but as a messenger. The horse strode with the low dignity of one who knows of both speed and home. He stopped before Rowan, lowered his great head, and pressed his muzzle to the man's forehead as he had once in the dark. There, in the hush where two worlds met, house and field, ledger and living, Rowan understood fully what Eleanor had set in motion. She had not wanted spectacle. She had wanted a choice. She had signed a scrap with an initial and set men to test their better angels. In her small, stubborn way she drew from beyond a summons: choose humanity, or be measured without mercy. Rowan wept then, not in the convulsive shame of the man who discovers his errors, but in the deep gratefulness of one who has been handed a map to himself. He placed the locket at Tempest's bridle and whispered forward the single line of apology that would not be enough but would be kept. Tempest whickered softly, and, as if to close some old ledger and open a new one, turned and led his horsefolk back down to the valley. The night was warm with the smell of earth and hay. The wolves were a distant geography, learned for once to keep their own circles. When Rowan finally stood alone upon his ridge, he spoke a line to the quiet that felt like a final knot tied on a changed life. It was not for the animals alone, but for himself and for the woman whose handwriting had been a compass. He said with a voice made small by honesty and made large by its reckoning, "Thus mercy, like a gentle flood, We'll lift the stones we thought immovable, and where pride made graveyards we shall plant again. And in the hush that followed, a single sentence of Eleanor's old tongue came to him, not written now on paper but sown into the air, as if her voice had learned patience and forgiveness both. If he can be softened by a horse, then let there be horses. If not, let there be lessons. The last light nor the first night did not need proof. The man had been changed by a simple animal, a scrap of a woman's script, and a wound that bled the truth. If this tale did stir thy breast, subscribe and ring yon bell that thou mayst join us anon for tales untold, and write below what mercy hath taught thee that others may learn by thy truth.